All right, so I just seared this pot roast and another pot roast, a chuck roast, because I'm making food for quite a bit of people. And this pan, I'm going to add a little bit of more canola oil. I seared them in about, I don't know, two tablespoons of canola oil. So I'm going to add some more here and get this, the fond, I think is what they call it, the encrusted, delicious, tasty bits of meat. Get it off the bottom here. I'm going to throw in one pickled jalapeno slice. If it were just for me and my family, I'd probably use two, but I know that sometimes, depending on like cultural palates, you might not be used to very hot flavors. So I want to be respectful of the people I'm making this food for. Some of them might not be able to eat pot roast that has 2 slices of pickled jalapeno, but you might be able to. And I'm going to take a little bit of flour, as you've seen before in other videos. Get that stirred around. Turn up the heat just a bit. Now the pot roasts, I had encrusted them in salt, pepper, basil, and fennel, and I let them rest for about an hour to bring them closer to room temperature before I seared them. I seared them on 4 minutes on each side on a medium-high heat. Just adding a little bit of organic flour here. Mentioned in another video that it's best to use organic when you're making foods at home, organic wheat, since they, I don't think they put as much glyphosate on organic wheat. On non-organic wheat, they use glyphosate or Roundup to dry out wheat berries and mature them. So they'll harvest them when they're green, and then they'll spray a pesticide on them to get them to mature. So it's an off-label use. And so, who knows if organic label really means anything? What people do behind closed doors, we don't really know that. We'd only know that through inspections and regulation, like enforcement through regulations. But I'm suspecting it's less. There's less glyphosate. So this is a little bit drier than I normally make it. If I had not put in that last bit of flour, that would have been fine. But I want to make a lot of gravy, and so the more flour I put in, the more liquid it'll take to get it to the consistency that we want. And so now we're just going to wait a few minutes and wait for the nutty flavor, for the flour flavor of the flour to disappear and for the nutty flavor to present itself. And I'm going to stop now so that you don't have to watch this whole process. Alright, so that nutty flavor has presented itself and it no longer smells like thick flour. So I have some broth that I've prepared. This is just made from bouillon, and it's vegetable broth. I actually prefer to use vegetable broth because I find that beef broth has a metallic taste to it that I don't find in vegetable broth. So we're just going to take a little at a time and add it in. So the way this flour mixture, this roux, puffs up and gets gummy, that's normal and to be expected. Just want to keep stirring it. And this broth I'm using, I had brought it to a boil, but then lowered it down to a simmer, so it's almost boiling. And you want to use hot, hot or warm broth when you're thinning out your gravies, because you don't want it to stop the cooking of the flour in the roux. So if you use like cold milk or cold water, even cold broth, it stops the cooking, and you're not going to be able to get the consistency you want as easily. You'll have to kind of do some management. So I always recommend using simmering or at least warm broth. And then you'll add about a half a cup at a time and incorporate it, get it homogeneous. Just keep going until you have the consistency that you want. I'm making this for a pot roast. I'm going to put the gravy in the pot roast, so I want it to be really thin for two reasons. One is, as the pot roast is cooking, the water is going to evaporate, and so the gravy will become thicker. The second reason is because after the pot roast has cooked, I'll bring it out of the oven, and instead of letting it rest, I'm going to shred it immediately. And what that does is it allows whatever liquid is around the meat to absorb into the meat quickly. The meat's kind of like a sponge at that point. So if I have a lot of gravy or a lot of liquid around the pot roast at that point, then it's going to soak it all up, and you'll have a very moist, tender pot roast. One might ask, why don't you just put liquid in there? Why do you need to make a gravy in the first place? And that's a good question. The reason I like to make gravies is because it binds the fat and the liquid together. It has an emulsifying effect, and so the liquid that you have at the end is basically equal parts fat and equal parts, or not, I shouldn't say equal parts fat and liquid, it's homogeneous. Second, the wheat that you used, it's going to get caramelized like bread. Gets brown in the oven, it's going to get caramelized, and it's going to have a sweeter, richer flavor, more complex flavor. So yes, you could just pour in broth if that's what you would like to do. You don't have time to make a gravy, that's fine. I just find that gravy makes every meal a little bit better. So as the gravy gets thinner, you need less and less time, obviously, in between adding liquid to get it to that thin consistency. I'm going to add a lot of liquid now. Just pour it in from the container. So it's going to be almost an au jus consistency. All right, now I'm going to just taste it to see if there's anything wrong with it. So as I was searing the pot roasts, you can see that some of the fennel and basil got burned. So I was a little concerned about whether that fennel or basil would impart a burned flavor into the gravy. And after having tasted it just now, I can say that it does not taste burned. And if it did, I probably would have sieved out, I would have scraped out the burned parts and retasted it and see if that helped, but it doesn't seem to be a problem. So I'm just going to go ahead and pour this in. And I'll, you know, I got to pick up this heavy cast iron skillet, so I'll show you what it looks like before I put it in the oven. So just bear with me for a moment. So here's the pot roast with the very thin gravy poured over it. I'm going to put it in an oven 350 and just heat it until the internal temperature is 190. Connective tissue dissolves at 190, and that's when you're going to get really soft meat. You could even broil it at 425. You could go lower and do 325. So the amount of meat that you have in conjunction with the temperature is going to determine how long you cook it. So it'll vary. And but I'm looking for 190 as the internal temperature for it to be shreddable. And I poured the gravy over the meat itself so that some of that wheat will be on top, so it'll caramelize. And as it's cooking, maybe every 30 minutes, I'll open it up real quick, pour some of the liquid over it so we can continue caramelizing. And if I see the top is getting too dry, I'll just flip them over. But remember, every time you open your oven's going to have to reheat to that temperature. So just be judicious. You don't want to open the oven every 15 minutes. You know, maybe 30 minutes is even kind of too much, but maybe once an hour, check on it. I think that this is going to take about 3 hours to cook. All right, so I've just taken the beef out of the oven. It's been in the oven for about 3 hours, and you can see it's still bubbling, and it just reached 190. So I'm going to go ahead and shred all of this meat, and then I'll show you what that looks like after it's done. Okay, so I just finished shredding the meat, and all of this liquid that we see as the meat cools, it's going to absorb into the meat, and you'll have this really flavorful, kind of silky mouthfeel with your pot roast. It goes great with mashed potatoes and rice. You could use it to make beef stroganoff if you have some leftovers. We have some little pho packs, beef pho packs. We're going to throw a couple of slices in that. So yeah, this is really versatile and delicious.